Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by just responding to one or two of the comments that Nick Smith made in his earlier contribution about completion rates, because that's something that I spent some time in a previous life looking into, and if anyone should be hanging their heads in shame about that, it should actually be the former national government in the late 1990s that established the industry training system in the first place, because actually the genesis of all of that was around the original passage of that legislation, and Bill Birch, who was the minister in charge at the time, his desire basically to say to industry, no matter where they were, everyone can have an ITO. Set up your own ITO, we'll slosh all this money around, and that's effectively where it all started. And yes, by the time it had reached its kind of peak of growth, there was some work that needed to be done. But there is another area in which was a design flaw again that the national government, their previous national government, was directly responsible for, and that is that when people enrolled in programs, in many cases they enrolled in those programs never with the intention of completing them, because they only ever wanted to do a part of the program in the first place. But the funding system was so inflexible that a business who wanted someone to, say, study a particular area, it might have been a health and safety area, had to assign them up with an ITO for a whole program, even if they never wanted them to do the whole program. It was a design flaw. And so what we found ITOs doing, for example, was over time they moved to establishing limited credit packages, which they were able to fund, which allowed businesses to target that investment more strategically, and that did lead to people being more inclined to complete those limited credit packages to completing whole qualifications. So it was actually a fault of the system designed and implemented by the previous national government. So before Nick Smith says that anyone should be hanging their head in shame, he might want to actually get his facts right and consider who it is that should be hanging their head in shame, because actually the previous national government were the ones responsible for designing that entire system. Now, I worked in the industry training sector, and I worked under contract for a couple of large companies in the oil and gas industry who used New Zealand's industry training framework, big oil, that's right, who used New Zealand's industry training framework to provide some of the training needs for their staff. And I'm very concerned that some of the provisions in this bill will create significant loopholes that first of all will allow the government funding of industry training to be exploited by large multinational companies, and that actually, rather than creating workers who are equipped for the New Zealand workforce, will actually create workers who are equipped, ready for the export market. Basically to go and work elsewhere within the multinational corporations' areas of operation, rather than being able to move seamlessly throughout New Zealand. So the New Zealand qualifications framework is designed to ensure the portability of qualifications within New Zealand. We have this system so that if someone is doing structured on-job industry training for one large employer, and they receive qualifications as part of that, they should be able to take those qualifications down the road if they go and get a job with another employer. It's one of the great virtues of our system, is qualification portability. However, if you take a large industry like the oil and gas industry, increasingly what I found working in that industry was that the large companies are far more interested in portability within their company's operations, than across the country. So they were saying, well, if we've got an oil plant here in New Zealand, an oil rig here in New Zealand, we do want someone to be able to operate that. We want them to be able to operate an oil rig run by our company to the same standard somewhere else in the world. We don't really care whether they can operate something else in New Zealand for a different company. They were interested in supporting their company's own interests, not the interests of the employee necessarily, and certainly not qualification portability. And one of the reasons I raised that, and I'm concerned about it, is because the wording in this bill around whether or not the training being delivered and paid for by government has to be part of the qualifications framework is incredibly sloppy. The businesses delivering training under this bill will have a lower standard of compliance with the qualifications framework to what an industry training organisation has to have. So effectively what we could end up doing is subsidising corporate training for large corporate companies that is not aligned to the New Zealand qualifications framework, that is purely in the interests of that company, not in the interests of the individual employee who's receiving the training, and that is ultimately not a wise or prudent use of the New Zealand taxpayer funding. If New Zealand taxpayers are going to be putting money into industry training, it shouldn't be purely for the benefit of a large corporate company who should be paying for that training anyway, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the areas which we see quite a lot, which we could see this happening quite a bit, is around the provision of health and safety training. Businesses should be providing health and safety training to their employees anyway. That is part of the cost of their doing business. And what this does is it allows large corporates, large companies to say, well, we have to do health and safety training anyway, let's get the taxpayer to pay for it, rather than them paying for it. They should be paying for that. That's part of the cost of them doing business. And actually what this is effectively amounts to, and we shouldn't be surprised because it's a national government bill, is it now creates another loophole which businesses, big businesses predominantly, can basically get more money out of the taxpayer for doing what they should be doing anyway. It's yet another example of the National Party throwing potentially huge volumes of taxpayer money at large corporates. That's effectively what the loophole that this bill creates. Because otherwise, why would the government, as they're doing in this bill, create a lower standard of compliance for a business delivering industry training to what they create for an industry training organisation? No answer from the government. No one's willing to even speak about it on the government side because there is simply no justification for it, because they know that this is creating another rort. This is opening up another loophole that can be totally and utterly rorted. The second big question I have, like a charter school, as Dr. Woods is saying, but the second question that I have, among many, is who is going to now take over the function of skills leadership for an industry if an industry training organisation is not going to do it? Because this is actually a big challenge for New Zealand. We have been really, really bad in New Zealand's history, particularly our recent history, of matching training and education to the actual skill needs of industry and the actual workforce needs that we have out there. One of the reasons that industry training organisations were given this leadership role in determining what skills industry required is so that we could actually get more strategic investment, so that we could actually not fund people to train in a whole lot of areas where we didn't need them to be trained, and we could actually target the investment into the areas where we needed it. And who are the best people to make those decisions? The industry themselves, through the industry training organisation. But they're going to have competing interests, because one corporate is going to say, if you take an industry which is dominated by large corporates, and the oil and gas industry is the one that I'm most familiar with, the players in that are going to have competing interests. And there needs to be some way of reconciling those. And that's actually one of the core roles of an industry training organisation. It's basically to get the big players together and say, well, across the industry, this is what we think the skill needs are going to be in the next 10 to 20 years, and this is how we're going to make real, how we're going to deliver on those things. The government taking that function away from ITOs begs the question, who's going to do it? Because if the industry training organisation is not going to do it, and there's no guarantee that anyone else is going to pick up that responsibility, the end result is that the taxpayer, the good old Kiwi taxpayer, will end up forking out a whole lot more money for training that is potentially, in the longer term, completely irrelevant. They could end up training more people in areas where they are unable to get work, or where the scope of their work is so narrow that when they leave the job that they are in at the moment, they are unemployable by anyone else. And that is something that the New Zealand taxpayer shouldn't be forking out for. If a company wants to train an employee for a specific niche role in their business, they should pay for that. The New Zealand taxpayer should be paying for transportable, portable skills that can work across industry in a number of businesses that actually give people choice and opportunity, and narrowing it down so that industry training can be specifically targeted to the narrow interests of one individual business is not a prudent use of the taxpayer's funding. It's a corporate subsidy, nothing short of that. And that's wrong. if we're funding industry training, and we should fund industry training, it should be for the benefit of those employees and for the benefit of New Zealand as a whole. It shouldn't be seen as a taxpayer subsidy to one individual company. And that is the loophole that this bill creates, and it does that in two ways: by allowing businesses to be funded directly rather than through the ITOs, and by removing the skilled leadership function from ITOs that helps to ensure that those skills that people are being trained in are portable and are what the whole industry needs rather than what one individual player within that industry needs. So those are some of the reasons why the Labour Party will be voting against this.
Kia ora, Mr Chair. Thank you very much. There's two sides to this bill. One is the apprenticeship side and the other is the industry training side. So just to be clear, some of the rhetoric that has gone on in the